The third morning, she found the tonic glass rinsed and replaced on the tray before the footman arrived, and something in her chest went still. She stood in the doorway of the old Duke of Merton's chamber with her candle and her ledger, and the very precise memory of having left that glass unwashed the night before. She had done it. Deliberately. A small test. A thing she told herself was nothing. Told herself was the habit of a woman who had kept too many sick-room accounts and grown suspicious without cause. The glass gleamed. The tray was ordered. And Gerald Hawthorne, the Duke's guardian and estate manager for 11 years, had been the only soul with a key to this corridor after 10 o'clock. Her name was Miss Cecily Marsh, and to the household of Merton Hall, she was only the apothecary's daughter from the village, brought in 6 months prior to sit with the old Duke through the worst hours of his long decline, to read to him, to measure his powders, to record each symptom in the plain hand her father had taught her. The Duke's physician, Dr. Farrow, visited once a fortnight. The guardianship was Gerald Hawthorne's. The household answered to no one else. She was 23 years old, and she had no rank, no family connection, no fortune of her own, and no one in that house who would believe her if she said aloud what she had begun to suspect. She closed the doorway quietly behind her and went to write it in the ledger anyway. The autumn had come on hard at Merton, the way it always did in that part of Shropshire, turning the grounds copper and brown in a single week, and pulling the warmth from the stone corridors until the footmen built fires before breakfast. Cecily had arrived in spring when the Duke was poorly but mobile, sharp enough to correct her pronunciation of certain Latin plant names, and to ask after her father's practice with something near to genuine interest. By midsummer he had taken to his bed. By September he was confused before noon, and lucid only in the early evening, after she had given him the plain willow bark preparation her father had sent from the village. The tonic prescribed by Dr. Farrow, a dark and bitter compound that arrived by courier from a London apothecary. She had begun quietly to record the timing and quantity of each dose with more care than the physician had requested. The Duke's nephew was expected at the end of October. She had heard Hawthorne mention it to the housekeeper, Mrs. Polly, with a tone she could not identify, something between satisfaction and impatience. Lord Ashworth will review the accounts. Naturally, Hawthorne had said. He will find them in order. He had not sounded like a man who expected to be questioned. He had sounded like a man who expected to be confirmed. She had written that down too. The days had developed a pattern she recognized by then, as the particular texture of waiting. Small, ordinary tasks performed with the knowledge that they were not ordinary at all. She measured the Duke's morning compound and recorded the hour. She read aloud to him from the volume of natural history he preferred. He liked the passages about migratory birds, and would sometimes rouse from what she had come to think of as the compound fog to add his own remarks about species he had observed on the grounds in his younger years. She wrote those remarks in the margin of her ledger in a different ink, because she did not know yet whether they counted as evidence of anything, but she was not willing to leave them unrecorded. She carried the trays herself rather than leaving them to the footman, because she needed to see the state of the glasses. She did not tell anyone she was doing any of this. She was an apothecary's daughter. She had been invisible in rooms before. Hawthorne had the easy confidence of a man who had managed a great estate long enough, that managing had become a form of ownership. He was perhaps 50, with a broad, pleasant face and a habit of addressing her by her occupation rather than her name. She was the nurse to the footman, your sick-room woman to Mrs. Polly. He was not unkind in any demonstrable way. He smiled at her in the corridor. He thanked her for her reports, delivered monthly to his study in the form she had been asked to use, recording date, condition, duration of lucid periods, and any notable changes. He read them in front of her and set them aside, and she had the impression each time of a man reading a document he had already decided contained nothing worth attending to. She had found it useful. A man who is not attending to you cannot notice what you are attending to. Lord Ashworth arrived on a grey Wednesday with 2 riding horses, a valet, and no prior warning of his early coming. Cecily learned of it from the sound of the front doors the sudden rush of footsteps below, and then, from Hawthorne's raised voice in the hall, not angry, she thought, but caught. She was at the top of the main stair with a tray when she saw him. He was taller than she had imagined from the estate portraits, darker and considerably younger than the gravity of his bearing suggested. 32, perhaps 33, with a lean jaw and eyes the color of pewter that moved through the hall with the specific attention of a man who expected things to have been altered in his absence and was already cataloguing the alterations. He wore a plain traveling coat, not the fashionable navy she associated with men of his standing, and he had not removed his gloves. His gaze came up the stair and found her. "Who are you?" he said. Not unkindly. The words were flat and level, the voice of a man who expected answers rather than deflections. "Miss Marsh, my lord. I sit with the Duke in the evenings." He held her gaze for a moment longer than courtesy required. Then he turned to Hawthorne, who had appeared at his elbow, with the practiced smoothness of a man resuming a role after a brief interruption. "She is a village woman brought in by the physician," Hawthorne said, his tone managing the words "village woman," so that they placed her precisely and dismissed her in the same phrase. "She has been adequate in her duties, though of course your lordship will wish to assess all current arrangements." Lord Ashworth did not reply. He was already crossing the hall toward the library. She went back to the Duke's room and wrote down the time, the date, and the word adequate. If you have sat with someone through a long illness, you know that the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning have a quality unlike any other, a suspension, a held breath, a sense that the ordinary rules of the house do not quite apply. There is a particular intimacy to those hours, not of warmth or affection precisely, but of shared vigil, of two people in a quiet room, while the rest of the house sleeps and the fire settles and the night presses itself against the windows. Cecily had spent many such hours with the Duke of Merton. She had come to know the particular rhythm of his breathing, the way he muttered in Latin when the fever rose, the exact degree of confusion that meant the night would be long, and the degree that meant he would be himself again by dawn. She had come, in the course of those hours, to be genuinely fond of him. Not in the manner of a woman performing fondness as part of her employment, but in the manner of someone who has sat long enough with another person to understand them, and who finds what they understand worth understanding. He had been a scholar before he was a duke. The books in his room were not decorative. He had opinions about botanical classification and the reliability of certain Latin translations, and when he was well enough to hold a conversation, he preferred to spend it on something worth saying. He had told her, once in a lucid hour, that she had a very good mind, and that it was a considerable waste to have spent it measuring compounds for old men. She had told him with great care that she considered the work of being present and attentive to be no waste at all. He had looked at her for a moment and then said, "No, I suppose it isn't," and turned the page of his natural history with hands that shook only a little. On the third night after Lord Ashworth's arrival, the Duke was, himself, more than himself. He took her hand and held it with a grip that surprised her, and looked at her face as if fixing it in memory. "The tonic," he said. "Tharrow's tonic. Yes. Your Grace? Has it changed?" "The taste." She said nothing for a moment. She had not told anyone what she suspected. She did not know if she had earned the right to speak, or to whom she might speak, or whether what she had written in her ledger amounted to anything a man of consequence would credit. "When did it change?" she asked instead. He looked at her a long moment. "Last winter," he said. "I did not think. I thought it was the illness." He released her hand. His eyes went to the ceiling. "There was a time," he said very quietly, "when I could manage a full morning's correspondence." She said, "Yes, Your Grace." She wrote that down when he had fallen asleep. And then she sat for a long time with the ledger in her lap, thinking about what she intended to do with it. Lord Ashworth's mornings were occupied with Hawthorne and the estate books. She knew this because Hawthorne ensured she knew it, ensuring she understood the household's order of importance, in the same casual way he had managed village woman on the stairs. His lordship has a great many matters to attend to, the housekeeper told her, when Cecily asked one morning whether there was a suitable hour to speak with him. He is not here for social calls, Miss Marsh. He is here to conduct a review of the estate. You would do well to keep to your own duties. She had not imagined she was making a social call. She observed Lord Ashworth at a distance in those first days, as she had learned to observe everything in the household, not directly, but with the peripheral attention of a person who has made a practice of noticing what others have decided is not worth noticing. He was methodical. He arrived at the library at 8 each morning and did not emerge until the dinner hour. He asked questions of the staff that were specific and unrepeated, which meant he retained the answers. He did not give orders in Hawthorne's manner, with the easy authority of a man to whom authority had become reflexive, but with a deliberateness that suggested each instruction had been considered. The footmen responded to him differently than they responded to Hawthorne, less smoothly, more carefully, as if they were not certain what he was looking for, and understood that it mattered. She tried the library the following afternoon and found him there alone, standing at the window with a letter in his hand and an expression she could not read. He heard her at the door and turned. "Miss Marsh, my lord?" "I am sorry to intrude. I wish to know whether you would review the physician's notes from the past 6 months. A pause. "The physician does not send notes to the estate." "No," she said. "He does not. I have kept them myself. I am an apothecary's daughter. My father trained me." She did not say please. She said, "I believe they are of some consequence to your visit." He looked at her for a long moment. The pewter eyes were not cold, she decided. They were careful. They moved over her face the way they had moved through the entrance hall, cataloguing, looking for what had been altered. "Bring them," he said. She brought them. She set the ledger on the library table and stood while he read, and she watched his face change as he turned the pages. His jaw tightened on the second page. On the fourth, where she had transcribed the Duke's own words about the taste of the tonic, he stopped and turned back. He reread something. He turned another page. He returned to the entries she had marked with the small notation she had invented for herself. A letter G, for glass, rinsed before dawn. He read for 12 minutes without speaking. She counted because there was nothing else to do, and because the silence was the kind that required some form of accounting. When he set the ledger down, he did not look up immediately. His hands rested flat on the open pages. "You left the glass unwashed deliberately," he said. "Yes. How long have you suspected?" 4 months. "And you said nothing to Hawthorne?" "I had no evidence. Hawthorne could not have explained away." "I waited until I had evidence that could not be explained at all." He looked up then. There was something in his face that she could not name. Something that was not admiration, not yet, but was adjacent to it. The way a man looks at a piece of work that has been done with more precision than he expected to find. "Why bring this to me?" he said. "You might have gone to Pharaoh. He comes once a fortnight and stays for 40 minutes. He has not sat with your uncle at 2 in the morning. He does not know what your uncle was in January compared to what he is now." She paused. "Also, the tonic is prescribed by the doctor." Lord Ashworth was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Marsh." She sat. He went to the door, locked it, and came back to the table. If Cecily had expected gratitude, she was not granted it immediately. What Lord Ashworth gave her instead was a series of precise questions asked in that same level voice, demanding specific dates, specific quantities, specific observations she had not written in the ledger because she had not known how to quantify them. She answered each one. He wrote them down in his own hand on a separate sheet of paper, copying nothing from her ledger without first asking her to confirm it. The process took an hour. She felt, during it, the particular sensation of being taken seriously by someone who was simultaneously reserving judgment, not dismissing her, not crediting her without examination, but holding her account in both hands and measuring its weight with a care that was itself a form of respect, though she would not have described it as such at the time. She had not often experienced that sensation. She had experienced being dismissed, and she had experienced being believed without examination, which was its own form of condescension, and she had experienced the particular variety of toleration that careful men extended to capable women who had made themselves inconveniently useful. This was none of those things. This was the attention of a man who wanted the truth and understood that the truth required precision, and who extended to her the courtesy of assuming she was capable of providing it. When they were done, he said, "I will need your cooperation for the next several days. I will need you to continue precisely as before, not to alter your routine, not to speak of this, not to allow Hawthorne or any member of this household to perceive that anything has changed." "Yes," she said, "you understand the difficulty of your position." He looked at her. "I do not think you do," he said entirely. He paused. "Hawthorne has been in this house for 11 years. He managed the estate through my uncle's marriage, my cousin's death, 3 tenancy disputes, and a flood that took out 2 of the lower farms. The household trusts him. The village trusts him. The county trusts him." He leaned forward slightly. "If this comes to nothing, if I am wrong, or you are wrong, or the evidence does not hold, your position here is forfeit, and your father's practice in the village with it. Hawthorne will see to that." She had known it. She had known it since the first morning she wrote anything down. She had made the calculation then, in the cold hour before the footman arrived, standing with a candle and a ledger in an empty corridor. This may cost you everything, and you may do it anyway. And if you choose to do it, you must be very precise. She had chosen. She had been precise. She was still standing. "I understand," she said. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he said with a precision that felt like something other than a command, "Come inside through the servants' passage if you need to speak with me privately. Tell she I have asked you to report the Duke's condition directly." She will be annoyed, but she will comply. She stood to leave. At the door she paused, because there was something she needed to know, and this seemed the only moment she would be permitted to ask it directly. "Why did you come early, my lord?" "You were expected at the month's end." A silence. Long enough that she thought he would not answer. "My uncle wrote to me in September," he said. "A short letter. He said he wished he could manage a full morning's correspondence." She looked at him. It was the phrase. He said he used it in every letter for 40 years. He would never have written it as a complaint. He wrote it because he could not do it anymore, and he wanted me to know that he remembered he had been able to. Cecily Marsh went back to her room and did not cry, because crying was not useful, and she needed to be useful for the next several days at least. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought about a man who had written the same small phrase into 40 years of correspondence, and the nephew who had understood what its absence that particular morning had meant. She thought that Lord Ashworth was not a man who missed things. She found somewhat to her discomfort that this was steadying. The week that followed required a particular form of endurance she had not practiced before. The endurance of performing ordinary things in full knowledge that they were not ordinary. She sat with the Duke each morning and evening recorded. His condition gave him the plain willow bark her father had sent, and gently delayed the Faro tonic, each dose by 15 minutes, then 20, then 30, noting in the ledger the small improvements in clarity and color that followed. She attended meals in the servants' hall. She responded to Mrs. Brisk's instructions about the proper timing of linen changes. She smiled at the guardian in the corridor and said, "Good morning," and he returned it with the particular warmth of a man who believes he is indulged for tolerating someone beneath his notice. 2 days into the week, he stopped her in the East Passage. His face was pleasant. It was always pleasant. She had come to understand that pleasantness was his primary instrument, the way an apothecary's mortar is an instrument designed to work smoothly and leave no evidence of its action. "I hope you are managing well, Miss Marsh," he said. "It is a heavy responsibility, sitting with someone in his condition. We are grateful for your care." He paused. "I trust Lord Ashworth has not been troubling you with questions." "He is thorough, which is admirable. But he is not always aware of how unsettling a review can be for those who serve the household. she said. "His lordship has been most courteous, Mr. Hawthorne." "Good, good." The pleasantness intensified slightly the way a lamp brightens before it gutters. "I expect the review will be concluded within the fortnight. His uncle's condition being what it is, Lord Ashworth will wish to make certain arrangements, and then return to London. It is a great deal to ask of a busy man, these visits." A pause. "A great deal to ask of the entire household." She understood what he was saying. She said, "Yes, it is," and continued down the passage. She was an apothecary's daughter. She had spent her childhood being adequate. She had learned to make herself invisible in rooms where invisibility was the price of being allowed to remain. And she had learned, in the years since, that invisibility was not the same as insignificance. She had been invisible in Hawthorne's assessment for 6 months. She had used every one of those months. Lord Ashworth she saw only in the evenings, briefly, through the servants' passage. He was systematically reviewing the estate accounts. He had written to a solicitor in London, whose name he did not share with her. He had written to a physician in Edinburgh, whose opinion he was awaiting on the composition of compounds administered to aged patients presenting with a specific set of symptoms. He did not tell her any of this directly. He told her what he needed her to know, and nothing more, which she recognized as the same economy she practiced herself, and which she found, therefore, more comprehensible than any elaboration would have been. What he did, consistently, was ask how the Duke was doing. Not as a procedural inquiry, but with a directness that made it something else. He asked what the Duke had said, whether the morning clarity was holding, whether there had been any indication of distress. She answered, with the precision she had applied to everything since spring, and he listened with the same precision he had brought to the ledger, and after the third evening of this, she understood that the care in the question was not administrative. He was asking because he needed to know his uncle was still there to be recovered. On the 5th day she came through the passage, and found him already standing, with the Edinburgh letter in his hand, and a stillness about him that told her the answer had come back, as he had feared. "It confirms it," she said. "It was not a question." "It does." He set the letter on the desk. His face was set, and even the way a man looks when he is containing something very large with deliberate effort. The compound Farrow prescribed has a secondary effect, when administered in the quantities and duration recorded in your ledger. It would not appear to a physician who visited once a fortnight and did not keep careful notes to be anything other than the natural progression of age and illness. She said nothing. Farrow, he said, did not prescribe it of his own initiative. I have spoken with him directly, privately, this morning. He was given the original case notes by Hawthorne before his first visit, and told the Duke's condition warranted something stronger than ordinary compounds. A pause. Farrow is not a criminal. He is a credulous man who trusted the guardian's account of the patient, and did not investigate further. And Hawthorne. Hawthorne, Lord Ashworth said, believed my uncle would be dead by Christmas, and the guardianship transferred to the estate's permanent management, his management, before any review could find reason to question it. He looked at her directly. He did not expect someone to be keeping careful notes. She thought of the ledger. She thought of 4 months of careful notes, each one made in the full knowledge that she might be wrong, that she might only be a woman making herself useful in ways that would later be judged excessive. She thought of the mornings she had sat in the corridor after the footman's knock, adding one more line to a document that no one in that house believed she was keeping. "What happens now?" she asked. "I have asked Hawthorne to attend me in the library at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. The solicitor from London arrives tonight." He paused. "I would like you present." She looked at him. "You are the primary witness," he said. "Your ledger is the evidence. I will not conduct this without you present to give your own account in your own words." She had not expected it. She had expected, if she were honest, to be thanked privately and managed away from the conclusion in the manner of someone whose usefulness was acknowledged but whose presence at the accounting was not quite proper. It was what she had been prepared for. She had decided she could accept it, that the Duke's recovery was the thing that mattered, and not whether she was permitted to stand in the room when it was confirmed. She stood for a moment in the servants' passage with the candle she had carried from the Duke's corridor, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite relief, and not quite certainty, but was the closest thing to both she had experienced in 4 months. "Yes," she said, "I will be there." He held her gaze a moment. Then, very carefully, he said, "Miss Marsh." Cecily. Her given name, deliberate, in a low voice. "What you have done, the precision of it, the patience of it. I would not have found it in time without you." She did not know what to do with that. She went back to the Duke's room and sat with the old man while he slept, and she held the candle on her knee and did not blow it out until morning. The morning of the library meeting, she chose her plainest gown and her steadiest hands, and arrived at the library door at 5 minutes before 10. The solicitor was already there, a precise, quiet man named Mr. Den. Colborne, who had arrived late the previous evening, and had the slightly compressed manner of someone who had read a great deal of documentation in a short time, and found it very much as he had been warned it would be. He acknowledged her with a small nod. He had the manner of a man who had adjusted his expectations already, and was not going to adjust them further. He arrived at 10 precisely. His face when he entered and found her standing at the table with her ledger was the most informative thing she had seen in 6 months. He controlled it immediately. The pleasant expression reassembled itself inside a breath, and she had seen underneath it, and she understood what was there. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse, but calculation. A rapid recalibration. The assessment of a man who has been caught in the act of presuming. Lord Ashworth spoke. Mr. Colborne produced documents. The ledger was read in relevant sections. Cecily answered questions when addressed by Lord Ashworth directly, and Hawthorne had the experience of standing in a room where a woman he had categorized as a village attendant gave precise, unimpeachable testimony about a period of 6 months during which he had believed himself unobserved. He did not raise his voice, he did not attempt cruelty. He was even in that room a man of a certain quality of manner, and it did not entirely desert him. Yet he was also by the end of the meeting a man who understood that 11 years of careful management had come to its end, because one young woman had chosen to write things down rather than look away. She did not watch his face as he left. She looked at the window, at the grounds of Merton Hall stretching out beneath the gray November sky, the copper leaves gone now, and the grass a pale, exhausted green, and she stood very still until the door had closed. If you have wondered as you have listened, whether a man who keeps his own counsel might also keep something else, a grief and a specific earned weight, this is where it surfaces. 3 days after Hawthorne had been removed from the estate by the solicitor and 2 county magistrates, Cecily came to the library to return a volume of botanical reference she had borrowed, and found Lord Ashworth standing at the window with a small portrait in his hands. He heard her and turned, and she saw before he could school his expression something that was very much like grief. Old grief settled into the bones, rather than fresh in the face. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to interrupt." "You are not interrupting." He set the portrait face down on the windowsill.
Well,
He had the manner of a man who had long ago decided that visible feeling was a luxury he could not afford, and who was now uncertain what to do in the presence of someone who had spent weeks watching him carefully anyway. She set the botanical reference on the table. She said because she could not say it, "Is that your cousin?" "In the portrait." A long pause. "My wife," he said. "She died 4 years ago. The last weeks were managed by a physician I trusted, and I have since come to believe that the trust was misplaced in ways I could not see at the time. She was quiet. That is why I came early," he said. "Not only my uncle's letter. When I read the letter and heard the phrase, when I understood that something was wrong, I thought of Eliza, and what I had not noticed, and I could not endure the idea of failing to notice again. The gray morning moved in the window. She looked at him. This careful man with his pewter eyes and his locked library, and his habit of issuing small commands that were functionally the only form of tenderness he knew how to offer. And she understood him then, with a completeness that had nothing to do with deduction. She understood that the precision he had brought to her ledger was the same precision he had not thought to bring to his wife's sick room, and that he had lived with the knowledge of that for 4 years, and that it had not made him cold so much as it had made him very careful about what he permitted himself to trust. He had trusted her ledger. He had trusted her. "You did not fail to notice," she said. "You came." He looked at her. "You read the letter, and you came early, and you read the ledger carefully, and you wrote to Edinburgh, and you did not allow Hawthorne to manage you." She paused. "You did not fail to notice. You arrived in time." He was quiet for a long moment. The gray morning moved in the window. Somewhere below, the household was at its breakfast, returned to its ordinary rhythms, the Duke upstairs in his bed taking only the willow bark and improving by measurable degrees each day. The portrait lay face down on the windowsill between them. Neither of them looked at it. She thought of all the things she had not said in that house, all the careful silences she had maintained by habit and by necessity, and she felt the habit loosening the way a muscle releases after long tension, and she was not certain whether she was glad of it or frightened of it, or simply too tired from 6 months of vigilance to resist it. She said quietly, "I am sorry about your wife," he said after a moment. "I am sorry you were left to manage alone for so long." They stood in the gray morning light without speaking. The fire had burned low. "Neither of them moved to tend it, Miss Marsh," he said at last. "My lord, I am going to ask you something, and I would like you to answer it honestly, and not in the way you have learned to answer things in this house, not as though honesty might cost you the right to remain here." She waited. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not in the capacity of a sick-room attendant. I intend to engage a physician from Bath who will manage my uncle's care going forward, and my uncle is improving. I mean, will you stay here at Merton?" "In whatever capacity makes sense to you." He paused. "In whatever capacity makes sense to both of us, when we have had sufficient time to determine what that is." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is not a very precise offer," she said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. "No," he said, "it is not. Are you asking me to remain as a companion to the household? As a member of the household staff? As something else entirely?" "I am asking," he said with great deliberateness, "whether you will remain at Merton Hall as someone whose company I would find it difficult to do without. The formal arrangements can be determined by the solicitor and by your own preferences, and by whatever conversation we find it appropriate to have once the household has returned to order." He looked at her directly. "I am asking you to stay. Cecily, that is what I am asking." She thought of her father's practice in the village, and the ledger on the library table, and a man standing in the early morning with his dead wife's portrait in his hands, reading grief into the phrase his uncle had used for 40 years, and coming early, and trusting what she had written. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." She was aware, in that moment, of a warmth at her wrist, where his hand had very briefly steadied itself against the edge of the table, close to hers, not touching, but near enough that she felt the warmth of it through the air between them. She did not look at his hand. She did not need to. Her body had been keeping its own record for weeks. That winter at Merton Hall was the first in some years to feel like a house where the fires were built for the inhabitants rather than for the impression of warmth. The Duke of Merton improved slowly and steadily under the care of the Bath physician, who found him, by December, able to manage an hour of morning correspondence. He wrote to Lord Ashworth on small sheets of stationery and a hand that was shakier than it had been, but legible, and the letters arrived via the footman rather than courier, because the Duke had taken to walking the East Corridor by mid-morning and preferred to hand them off in person. He had discovered in those walks that Cecily tended to come up the East Corridor from the servants' passage at about the same hour, carrying a cup of hot willow bark for whichever member of the household had presented with a cough or a winter chill, and that Lord Ashworth tended to emerge from the library around that same time on the pretense of reviewing something in the estate ledger that was kept in the ground-floor study. The Duke of Merton was 81 years old, and he had been managing people at Merton Hall for 50 of those years, and he was not confused. He said nothing. He walked his corridor and handed off his letters, and felt something loosening in his chest that he had not known was tight. Lord Ashworth proposed on an evening in late November, formally, and with a solicitor's blessing already secured, and her father's answer already in hand, and then he asked her the same question again in private, without ceremony, in the library, with the fire low and the snow beginning outside, because he wanted her answer without the architecture of the occasion around it. "Miss Marsh," he said, "Cecily, will you marry me?" She thought of everything she had been in that house. Adequate, a village woman, a sick-room attendant, a source of careful notes that no one had expected to matter. She thought of a ledger and a rinsed glass and a man who had read 12 pages in silence, and then looked up and asked when she had started to suspect. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came to where she sat. He took her hand very carefully in both of his. He held it the way a man holds something he has been afraid to lose, and he did not say anything for a long moment, because he was not a man who had extra words, and the ones he did have were already spoken. Then he said quietly, "I am glad you kept the ledger." "I am glad you read it," she said. "If you have listened this far, and found yourself wondering whether a quiet woman in a plain gown with careful handwriting is enough, she is always enough. She was always enough. The world's failure to see it is the world's failure, not hers." Outside the library window, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the grounds of Merton Hall, settling on the copper leaves that had not yet been cleared from the east walk, filling in the gravel paths in slow silence. The Duke upstairs would see it in the morning and call for his stationery, and write a letter in a shakier hand to his nephew, on the floor below. The letter would say, as it always said, that the grounds were looking well, and that he hoped to manage a full morning's correspondence. This time it would be true. The fire burned down, and neither of them moved to build it up, because the warmth of the room was sufficient, and the snow outside was very quiet, and there was nothing left in that house that required watching, or recording, or setting down in careful notes for the benefit of someone who might one day need to know what had happened here. She set her ledger on the table beside the fire, and left it there. She would not need it anymore. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments below.